Today I'm going to talk about how to speed up a WordPress website and make it go fast, very, very fast. And we're going to go past just like the basic techniques and kind of like surface level easy things and really show how you can get a website performing as quickly as it can go without spending more than just like an hour or two speeding it up. So that's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, we need to talk about the hardware side of it though, and how to choose a good web host that is going to be fast for you. So some things to consider when looking at various web hosts is one, what are they on the newest like software? Are they keeping Apache and MySQL up to date? And so look at that, make sure they're not too far behind. Same with like HTTP2 support, make sure they have it. And pretty soon HTTP3, when that comes out, that makes a big difference. So you have to have at least HTTP2. And then something called IOPS, and this is like how many IO operations that you're allowed to do, like per second or however often it's measured. And so some web hosts will limit you on this, and so you want to look past all the marketing that says, oh, we have a super fast SSD drive that we use and it's so fast, but then when you actually sign up for an account, then you're limited and you don't get the full speed of that SSD drive. So that is something that some web host companies will do. Typically, if you are on a VPS, a virtual private server, or a dedicated server, you won't have any of those limits that you have to worry about. But if you're on a shared server, then it's very likely that there will be limits like that. So look at the IOPS if that information is available to you and you're signing up for a shared server. You also want to look at how much memory is available to you, both overall memory, and some web hosts will limit you on each individual connection. Especially if it's a shared web host. If you have your own dedicated server, then you should be able to choose how much memory is used on each connection, but you'll still be limited on the overall amount of memory. So you need those are the things that I kind of look at when comparing web host. And then the last one, which is kind of a plus if they have it, web host I use doesn't, but railgun support is pretty cool. That's something that is a feature that Cloudflare offers, but it requires special configuration to be done by your web host, and they have to pay money to Cloudflare as well. So you either have it or you don't, and so if you do have it, that's a nice plus as well. So that is how to choose a high performing server. Just kind of a quick brief overview, and then for the fun stuff. So once you have your web host and your setup, you want to set up a few different layers of caching. So let's see, PHP has its own op cache. Let's just start from the bottom and work our way up from there. So the first layer of caching that you need to configure yourself is going to be either Redis caching or Memcache. And you want to make sure that whatever web host you sign up with supports one of those. I use Cloudways for hosting, and they support both of them. And I prefer Redis. So over here on our test website, let me go to the Redis object cache by Till Cruz. that is the plugin that I like to use. And then when you first set it up, you just click a button on here that says enable object cache, and that's, oh, there's one other thing you might want to do. Yeah, my hosting utilities plugin takes care of it automatically for me. But you do need to make sure that you have on, there's some constants that you need to add to your WP config file to add a prefix for your Redis object cache to make sure that your object cache on your website doesn't mess with any other websites that are on the same server. So you have to set that up if you're running multiple websites on the same server, which is normally the case. So that has to be set up. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to should be able to see this command prompt now. Oh wait, it's not showing. Boom. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to quickly SSH into this website here. Why didn't it copy? Windows does that on me sometimes. It doesn't copy when it's supposed to. Okay. Okay. So I'm SSH'd into the website here. And oh, that one's old. That's the old way of doing it. Okay, so if I look at my config file here, got a few things in here that are all related to performance. So I guess we can talk about all of them. But the stuff I wanted to show is this is how I tell Redis that right here I'm on test site B with that random string at the end, and that is my random Redis prefix to make sure that my website never clashes with any of the other websites on the same server. And then it should be sufficiently random that no one else on the server can start poking around and looking at my settings inside of Redis. So I do that. I only do it when I'm on the actual server, so I don't get any problems when I create a staging site on the same server and it's trying to use the same cache key. So that's why I have this condition here in the code. And wait, what is this doing? If server name is that, create the cache key, otherwise, oh, otherwise it creates the staging key. Staging's at the end of this one. Yeah. Yep. Okay. And then I'm also disabling the cron job unless it's an AJAX request. And so I have the cron job disabled here, but then let me hide my SSH. Okay. So then over here in my hosting, I use Cloudways for hosting. So over here, I have it set up on here, or I will set it up. I have it set up, except you can change that to every minute. So in here, every minute, we are going to run wp-cron.php, and that's going to take care of anything WordPress needs to do on a scheduled basis. It'll trigger that and make sure it happens. And so instead of, by default, WordPress checks if it needs to run any cron jobs on every single request made to WordPress. And so instead of doing it on every single request, now we're just doing it once per minute, or if it's an AJAX request. So that's just a tiny improvement. Doesn't make that big of a difference. And then the memory limit and max memory limit, setting that to be as big as I can. It doesn't actually use up that much memory unless it has to, and it is still limited. And my settings in here, I still have the max memory limited to, I think it's like about 200 megabytes that I limit that to per request, which is more than it needs. But yeah, so that's what I have that set to. So I just wanted to show that to you guys real quick. Okay. Oh, I forgot to re-enable that when I was pointing to stuff. Yeah, it is. Those are my settings. Okay. So now back to the website. So that is Redis. Oh, I should explain what Redis actually does. So WordPress by default, when you do some when you do some action like querying the database, then by default WordPress will store the information from that query in what it calls the object cache. And okay, sorry for that distraction. Okay, so by default, when WordPress does like a query, then the data from that gets stored in the object cache. So then if you need to access that data again, WordPress doesn't have to go back out to the database and ask for that information again. And the object cache is just basically means it's storing it in global variables or inside of an array that's global. So as soon as the request finishes, then that object cache only lasts for the duration of the request. But if you use something like Redis, then that data, once it's put in the object cache, can be reused on requests that other people make to the website. And so it's good for more than just that one request. So that helps speed things up, and that is why we need Redis. So I always install it on every website. I find that it helps the back end of the website load fastest. That's where it really shines, is in helping the back end load a little bit faster. It's not a huge difference, but it helps a tiny bit. So might as well enable it. So we got that set up. Next up, let's talk about the big caching plugin, the one that has all of your options for caching the page. I have 3 different ones I'm going to talk about today: Breeze, WP Rocket, and Swift Performance. And then after you set up one of those caches, then the last cache is your CDN or edge cache. And I'll use either Cloudflare or StackPath for that. So let's start with Breeze first, because that's one of the simpler ones. And it's free. Free is good. Okay. So these are the options for Breeze. You can see that it's not a whole lot to it, which is nice. And so you can say, let's minify the CSS, JavaScript, HTML, and then store it in a cache on that person's browser, so that, let's say I load an image from a website and then reload the page, I don't have to load that image again. So we want the browser cache enabled. So we'll enable all of those. You can also enable those 2 as well if you want. And then in here, you group the CSS and JavaScript. With HTTP2, it's not as important, but I find that most WordPress websites are doing like 100 requests or more. So usually grouping some of that together will make sense. But I can show you later on when we look at web page test, how you can actually tell if grouping files together is a good idea or if you should keep them separate. Okay, so once you do group it, it is very common for this to break websites. So you want to go and visit your website, inspect it, and not inspect it like this. You actually want to open it up in an incognito tab. So you're looking at it fresh, and then make sure that this is the only thing open in incognito, and then close out of it, and then reopen it fresh again the next time you check, and do that every single time you change any settings in your caching plugin to make sure you're not breaking stuff. And then when you do pull it up, you also can do Control-Shift-R to do a hard refresh to completely clear out the cache. And that's how you can test how long it takes your page to load if it's like starting from completely cleared out. But sometimes even better than Control-Shift-R is just deleting and then going back in like that. So those are the options in Breeze. That's pretty basic. Like, there's not much to it. So if you just want something that's very quick and easy to set up, then I like to use Breeze. Database optimizations I do with a different plugin. If you're using a CDN, then like I can put in the information from a stack path CDN and put that information in here, and that's where you do that. Varnish. Oh, I forgot to mention Varnish. So Varnish is in between the page cache, which in this case is Breeze, so in between Breeze and the CDN. So it works like this. So you make a request to a website. Let's say you want to load just a basic request to load some content on the page. So the request first goes to the CDN. That could be Cloudflare or it could be StackPath, whatever you set up in here. And then if the CDN has a copy of the content, it'll send it back to you. If it doesn't, and for PHP requests that you can't really cache, it's not going to have a copy, and it's going to have to send that back to the server. Once you get to the server, Varnish is in memory, so it's very fast. So if it hits the Varnish cache, then it's able to immediately find the content and send it back. If Varnish doesn't have it, then it continues on, and the next cache, which is the one created by Breeze, sits on the hard drive, so it can store a lot more stuff in cache, and it'll check if it's in the Breeze cache. And then lastly, if all of the caches fill and it has to regenerate the content, or if you're logged into the website, which prevents it from being able to cache that content, if one of those cases happens, then it might end up going all the way back to the WordPress application. WordPress will load, but then as WordPress is loading, you still have that Redis cache that could prevent it from doing some database request or other similar stuff that could be stored in Redis. And if it's not in Redis, and then you go all the way to the database usually have their own cache as well. And that is kind of the flow of all of the different caches that a request will pass through. And hopefully it doesn't end up going all the way back to the server, but we put in all of those different levels of caching to try to catch a request as soon as possible. But then when it needs to, I mean, that's just the way it's set up. You have all of those different layers of caching. So that's that. And we'll talk about the database later, and that is Breeze. Let's go ahead and disable Breeze and move on to the next caching plugin that I like to use. So Breeze is good if you just want to do something quick, but WP Rocket is a little bit better. It's still nice and simple, but the difference is that WP Rocket does cost money. So yeah, so if you want to spend a little bit more money and get something that's nice and well maintained, I found that the WP Rocket shines as being very reliable. They test everything well. It's a plugin that's been in operation for a long time, so WP Rocket is reliable. We have, let's see here. Wait, is this not? Oh, that's mobile. Okay, so you have your different settings. Some of them are just the same as before. We can minify the CSS and then we can combine them, but only if it doesn't break the website, because sometimes it can break the website. And then we can combine Google fonts. That's something that I think is newer. This is doing the critical CSS. That when the plugin asks you about generating critical CSS, that's only useful on pages that are very long, because what it'll do is just generate the CSS that needs for the top of the page. But then if there's a whole bunch of stuff later on the page that requires additional styling, having something like this will help speed it up. Otherwise, you don't need to have that enabled. And then, yeah. So those are those settings. They got lazy load for the images on here. Okay, disabling emojis. Usually, you don't need that enabled. If it's enabled, then there's some extra JavaScript that's sent to turn emojis into emoji images. Okay, so let's talk about preloading. Well, actually, let's get back to that one in a little bit. Let's talk about web page tests, because this is how you know what optimizations you need to do. So over here, been recording for a while. Okay, over here on web page test, here's what I've already run the test on the page. This is what it looked like before I did any optimizations. The website's pretty basic, so there's not much to see here, but I want to explain what everything on here means, because this is kind of like the I don't know, your guiding crystal of how to tell what optimizations you need to do is looking at web page test, and this will really pinpoint problems for you if you understand what it means. So right here we have the green, orange, purple thing, which up here you can see it means DNS connection SSL. So when we first connect to the website, it has to look up what IP address goes with the website. That's the DNS part. It looks it up. After it looks it up, then it has to start connecting. Once it's connected to the website, then it has to establish the SSL certificate so that you can load it over HTTPS. And altogether, that took 0.2 seconds. So then the next part from the on is just that initial content that it loads. Then the green is for CSS. We see that because we have HTTP2 on the server, it's able to load both of these at the same time. And the DOM content ready event got triggered right here. This is once all of the content was downloaded for all the content that you need for the DOM. But you can see that that DOM content ready event lasted a long time. It wasn't just like a tiny slice of time. There's a lot of JavaScript that was being run all throughout for 0.6 seconds. And it wasn't until that finished that Chrome then realized, hey, there's some more files that it told me to go fetch after the DOM was ready, this, and this. So you can see that it would be a little bit better if these were fetched maybe a little bit earlier before the DOM ready event. So you might want to look at why are we waiting to load these JavaScript files and these CSS files. Wouldn't it be a better experience if these files loaded as soon as we needed them? Are we adding these files to the website on the DOM ready event when we could just add them in directly inside of the HTML instead of adding them with JavaScript? Why are they being added later on? So if we look at these, what these JavaScript files actually are, we see this one's about embedding stuff on the page. That's index.js, that one is more important. Emojis, we don't even care about those. And the print CSS, that's only if you're printing the page. So even though these are being loaded later, it looks like we actually do want these to be loaded later because they're not that important except for this one. But is it really that bad if the JavaScript loads after the DOM is ready? That's probably what we want anyways. This JavaScript that's loading here is probably more important. And so we probably want this loading first and then this later. I don't really see this as being much of a problem, but if these were some other assets that you really wanted to be loading as soon as possible, then you could see that there's this big gap here while all of this JavaScript is being loaded, and that would make you question why. That's something that this web page test pointed out to us. Okay, over here we see that the last thing to load was the fonts. And then after that there's New Relic, which is just for monitoring the health of a website. That's not important. This red thing was a favicon that we don't have set up on the website, so that's fine. That's also New Relic. So those are not important, and they are loading after this blue line is the on-page load event. So that's when the spinner on the spinner icon on your tab stops spinning. So these are loading after the icon. So that's good. They're not actually interrupting the page load. And then the last thing to load is the font. Until it loads, then we can use whatever default font, and then it'll swap out for this one. I think that is fine. This is all good. I mean, it's a pretty basic site to start with. Okay, so here's another website that I wanted to show you to try to show you a few other things that you might see. So on here we see this website is making some requests out to some third-party assets on so like this one's at fonts.googleapis.com. So before you can load something from fonts.googleapis.com, you gotta look up the IP address for fonts.googleapis.com. You have to connect to fonts.googleapis.com, and you have to do that SSL handshake. So one of the optimizations that we can do is you can preload this connection. So the green, orange, and pink, we can move that to happen way over here for all of these websites, all of these assets. And so that would shift the start of this loading from here to there, the start of this from here to there, and all of these would be shifted over just a little bit. Well, you can see this one right here. You can see on this one it was preloaded. The connection happened here, and then once the browser was ready to actually load the font and it wasn't busy, and Chrome decided to load the font right here. but Chrome was able to choose when to load it and load it at the appropriate time. And it didn't have to go through that connection process. It could just immediately start. So that is good. That is what we want. So if we go back to WP Rocket, it talks about preloading right here. Or prefetching right here, DNS request. We want to prefetch the request. So I said preload when I meant prefetch. So right here we would put down fonts.googleapis.com. I think that was the website. And then that'll tell it to establish the connection as soon as possible instead of waiting until it needed the request. We're giving these hints to Google that, hey, we're going to need to connect to this website later on. Please establish the connection immediately so that when we're ready to start downloading content, then we can download the content later on. So that's that. And then one of the other things that you want to look into is when you have two items running side by side or more items running side by side, can look at what would happen if you okay, let's go back. Okay, so on the file optimization, when we combine the CSS into multiple files, so for a website like this, combining those two items into one file is going to make this take longer. But by having it split up into two files, we can load it, these two, and we're going to finish quicker. If they were both, if we had to load both of them, we're going to be pushing out when it finished, which is right here, we're going to be pushing that out, and it's going to take longer until the CSS finishes. And you can see that the Chrome doesn't want to load anything else until the CSS finishes. It's waiting for this CSS request to finish before it continued on with these items. Probably because these fonts that it's trying to load is probably the CSS that told the fonts to load. And so that's why it's waiting. But we want that CSS done quicker. So we split it up into two files that load at the same time. So do we want this turned on? No. But let me tell you when you do want it to be turned on. So let's say that we had the same type of scenario, but loading at the same time as these CSS files was a great big long image that was really big, and we also had like maybe multiple images that were all loading at the same time, and they were taking a lot of time, maybe some long JavaScript, and then the CSS is just taking we might have a whole bunch of tiny CSS files that are all loading in parallel, but if we loaded them at the same time, it still wouldn't. We don't have anything else that's waiting on the CSS to load. We're waiting on like the images and the JavaScript and the other stuff to load. We're not really waiting on that CSS to load quickly. In that case, there's no benefit from loading a lot of little CSS files to one big file. But there is a benefit to loading it as one big file, because when you have it as a bigger file, then it makes it more efficient at compressing. When you're doing your gzip compression, it can gzip it better if it's one big file. So I don't really have an example to show you right now, but hopefully that kind of explains when you would want the setting turned on and when you should have it turned off. And the same goes for the JavaScript combine. You can always minify. That's always a good thing to do. But combining, you kind of need to look at what's actually going on to know if you want to combine or not. You want to look and see if you need to prefetch anything. See, on this one, we didn't need to prefetch, but on here, it's obvious that we have all of these green or pinks that could be done sooner. And of course, the very first one's always done as soon as possible. media